Professor Mackridge, good morning.
Good morning.
It's a great pleasure for us you accepted to offer this interview. We would like to start by asking you about your family background. If you would like to say a few things about your parents, your sisters or brothers, and your early influences during your childhood.
Well, I mean, I'm the first person in my family to have gone to university. So I suppose, you know, I'm a beneficiary of the post-war regime, you know, that we had in England, where people were sent to university on full grants, etc. You know, we didn't have to pay anything to go to university and all that. Those were those golden days where we were very lucky. But my parents didn't go to university. I think they both had the qualifications to go, but their parents didn't have enough money. I mean, both my grandfathers were what I call mechanics. They were actually engine fitters, so they were skilled manual labourers. Obviously my father moved up socially because having worked during the interwar period at Shell Petroleum in London, he was in the advertising department, the publicity department. Having served in the British Army in the war, he came back to England and started up his own advertising company. So he had his own company. It was very small and not particularly successful, but you know, at least he was able to. He actually was able to send me away to private schools.
That was just after the war.
Yes, he started his business. I don't know when, but I mean, I was born in 1946. He must have started his business sometime soon after that, I think. But although my parents hadn't been to university, they were both, you know, they were both quite wide readers. My mother would read novels more than anything else. My father was not only very well read in literature, but also in history. He was, I mean, I would call him an amateur historian. Not that he ever wrote anything, and certainly not published anything about history, not at all. But he read a lot of history, mostly English history, but he knew a lot about world history. And this, you know, was an interest that lasted him throughout his life, in fact. He died at the age of 95, just 10 years ago, in 2004. And clearly his interest in history must have influenced my interest in, well, not so much history, but my interest in the past anyway, and my interest in trying to discover more about the past, you know, a sense that the past could be known. It was a foreign country, but it could be explored and it could be known. But it was the literary side of both my parents, I suppose, that really pushed me into my career rather than the historical side, as you know, because I mean my job was always as a teacher of literature rather than history. But I mean, I was brought up about 30 miles away from London, and for some years, from the age of 2 onwards, of course I don't remember anything before that, but from the age of 2 onwards, we were living in a village in Surrey, and then we moved, in fact, outside the village. We were between 2 villages, and my childhood was spent surrounded by rivers and woods and farms and riding stables and all that sort of thing, pigs and cows and sheep and everything, and lots of walks in the country. And you know, I've retained a great love of the natural world because of that. And my parents were both very you know, very keen nature lovers themselves, even though they were born in sort of rather suburban backgrounds. But so those were very important influences. I have 2 younger brothers, but because I was the first to be born, and then my mother had a daughter, Anne, who unfortunately died within a few weeks, perhaps even a few days of her birth. there was actually quite a long gap between me and my next brother, Rafe, who was 5.5 years younger than me. And then John was 2 years younger, I mean, they're still going strong. And so for the first 5.5 years of my life, I was an only child, and I think that influenced my personality. You know, I've always been a very kind of independent, not very sociable person, actually. I mean, I learned to become sociable, but I wasn't naturally sociable, as it were. I had to sort of teach myself how to be sociable. And, you know, friends haven't really, I mean, I don't have many friends of my own individually. I mean, Jackie and I, my wife and I, have friends between us, but I don't go off on my own and see, let's say, male friends, you know, in this sort of buddy kind of thing. You know, one of the things I really hate about the cinema is so-called road movies where there are two men crossing America on a motorbike or in a car. I find that, you know, totally an off-putting thing. In fact, I much prefer female company to male company myself. But that's because I was deprived of it when I was a child, I think, you know, not having a sister.
You grew up with two brothers.
I grew up with two brothers. My poor mother was the only woman in the house, and she made us realise that she felt very much, you know, a sort of minority of one. You know, she was dominated by the males in the house. And then, you know, when I went to school, I went to single-sex schools, apart from 1 year when I was 5 years old. My first year of school was in a mixed school. I had girlfriends at the age of 5 or 6. But after that, I went to single-sex schools, and
just boys.
You know, females were sort of very much sort of not part of my life. And then, you know, living as we did out in the country. You know, we were only about 4 miles from a town, Guildford, but that was far enough. It meant that there wasn't a big circle of people around anyway. We didn't have many neighbours, let alone, you know, other children who were friends of mine. So I didn't have many friends. But I think I was never, I mean, my mother always used to say to me, I was never bored. You know, I mean, how kids get bored. They sit around saying, Mum, I don't know what to do, I'm bored. I never used to do that. I always used to find things to do. I mean, things to do, you know, kind of intellectually. Reading, writing, playing games, you know, sort of on my own, really, until my brothers came along, and then I would play games with them. I mean, my brothers, having said that I didn't have many friends, I would say that my brothers were my best friends, in fact. I mean, I've always got on very well with them, and I still do. And, you know, one of the sort of, you know, what people imagine, you know, what's the ideal dinner party? Who would you invite, you know, to the ideal dinner party? And I would say my brothers and their wives as well, because I get on very well with them too. And you know, we all get on very well together, which is very nice. And Jackie gets on with them as well. So we're quite a happy family in that way.
And then, how about the school years?
The first proper school I went to was a preparatory school. That was a private school in Guildford, which meant that I commuted on the bus every day. You know, it's not very far. It only took about 20 minutes on the bus. There, I must have started doing Latin very early. I don't know how old. I mean, I was at the school from the age of 6 to the age of 11. And so, let's say I started doing Latin maybe at the age of 8. And there was one Latin teacher, one classics teacher there called Mr. Aldridge. I'm going to say one. He was the only one who taught classics. He was a wonderful teacher and a wonderful man altogether. He was an RAF war hero, and he had been shot down at some point in his plane, and he lost both his legs, and he had artificial legs. But that didn't stop him from being quite a good rugby umpire. And he used to run around on these 2 artificial legs with his whistle, running after the boys who had the ball, you know, and making sure that the rules were being kept. Anyway, he took me aside one day, because I obviously must have been good at Latin, and said, have you ever thought about doing Greek, studying Greek? And I remember him saying,
was this an optional course? just for the people who work
well,
the
I mean,
idea.
I'm not going to start explaining to you know, the very complicated systems that we have, education systems we have in this country, and of course they change from time to time as they do in Greece. But it's very, very complicated, and really at private schools in those days they were practically free to do what they wanted. Aldridge wanted somebody to teach Greek to, and he said to me, Greek is a much more civilized language than Latin. I remember him saying, because he said, you know, okay, both the Greeks and the Romans wrote about war, but the Greeks wrote about much more interesting things as well, you know, the drama and the philosophy and everything else as well. So he said, if you're interested in doing Greek, I think you'd be good at it, but you know, go away and talk to your parents about it. My parents had never studied Greek. They had done Latin at school because Latin was compulsory in those days, in their day. I think my father thought really that classics was, he had some kind of romantic idea about the classics as being not only romantic actually, but rather practical too, because in the circles in which he was moving, even though he came from quite a modest background, he had clients who were obviously richer than he was. He came across people who had university degrees from Oxford or Cambridge in classics, and you know, he was obviously impressed by this and thought, you know, this is, you know, quite the makings of a successful career if you have an Oxford or Cambridge degree in classics. It had to be Oxford or Cambridge as far as he was concerned. He didn't want his sons to go anywhere else. I went to Oxford. My two brothers, neither of them actually went to Oxford or Cambridge, but still they went to university. So anyway, my parents were encouraging, and I continued to do Greek. I started to do Greek. So probably for the last year or two of my school there. Then I changed school to a grammar school, which is a state school, also in Guildford, but they didn't do Greek there. It wasn't part of the syllabus. Because it was a state school, it was a much more regimented syllabus, you know, unlike the private school where they were much freer to teach what they wanted. And so they did Latin, not Greek, and I found because of this, I think, although I didn't realise it at the time, that I wasn't performing so well at this grammar school. From being top of the class at the prep school, I was finding myself being almost bottom of the class at the grammar school. This was, of course, partly because grammar schools, as you know, were selective schools. In other words, you got into a grammar school on the basis of an examination, a competitive examination called the 11 plus. This was a national examination which doesn't exist any longer. And so all the boys who were at my grammar school had, by definition, passed the 11 plus examination. My father was clever enough to realise that something was wrong, and that, you know, why had I suddenly changed from being the top of the class to somewhere near the bottom? And he said, "Is it because you're not doing Greek?" And I said, "Well, maybe it is. You know, I hadn't really thought about that, but maybe it is. You know, I'm not so happy." And so amazingly, he arranged for me to go to a private boarding school at Eastbourne on the coast near Brighton. And without him knowing anything about classics, it just happened by amazing coincidence, amazing luck for me, that the teachers of classics at my public school, from the age of 13 to 17 that is, were absolutely brilliant. They were people that I really liked. I mean, I really liked them as human beings. They were inspiring teachers, especially two of them, including the headmaster actually, Michael Burley, who didn't really have any duties to teach, but he liked teaching occasionally. And you know, it was a great luxury because the headmaster, who was actually very young at the time, but you know, to us he was, you know, like a god, would descend to the classroom and teach us. He didn't teach anybody else. He only taught those who were doing advanced Latin and Greek, especially Greek. And you know, we would read, for instance, Euripides together. Even though they were not part of the syllabus, texts that were not part of the syllabus for examination, we would just read them in Greek, you know, for fun. And that was great. I mean, it was wonderful because and my other important classics teacher, Mr. Henderson, he was wonderful too. And you know, we were a very small number of people doing Greek, especially from the age of 15, 16, 17, the more advanced. There were probably only about 3 or 4 boys in the class doing Greek. and so you know it was pretty individual tuition. So it was a great privilege to be studying this language, which was even in those days very little studied. Of course, now it's even less studied.
And how did you become interested in modern Greece?
Yes, well, one of my teachers, another teacher, I've mentioned Michael Burley, who was the headmaster, and Henderson, who was the main classics teacher. There was another teacher, Roger Mills, who came to us only for a year. He'd just graduated from Cambridge University, so he was not much older than us, really.
He was a young
one of the things, one of the attractions about Roger was that he had been in the Cambridge Footlights. Now, I don't know whether you've heard of the Cambridge Footlights, but the Cambridge Footlights, I think it still goes on today, was a theatrical group of undergraduates, but instead of putting on plays, they put on satirical shows. And this was the time of Beyond the Fringe and all the sort of political satire that was becoming very fashionable in Britain around about 1960. And he was fresh from Cambridge, and he, in fact, inspired some of us, including me, to put on a. And when I say a satirical show, I mean a review. It was called a review, of course, Epitheorisy. So we put on a review of our own while he was there. That 1 year that he was there, I say just 4 boys, including myself, and we actually wrote the whole thing ourselves and performed in it, you know, entirely ourselves. Anyway, Roger Mills, one of the things he wanted to do was to go to Turkey. And he found that he and his wife, if they got together a group of boys, they could travel free and take us on a classical tour. Now, in order for it to be a classical tour, it had to be Greece as well as Turkey. He really wanted to go to Turkey, but he thought he'd better say Greece as well in order to persuade the boys' parents, you know, that it was worth paying £50, that was all it was, for about a month. We went by train to Istanbul. So we started off in Turkey. And so I saw Turkey before I ever saw Greece.
That was mid-60s?
This was in 1962 when I was 16. And, you know, this was obviously a life-changing experience for me because I saw these two countries for the first time. I'd hardly been abroad. In fact, I think I'd only been abroad once, that's right, once with my parents to France for a few days. So it's only the second time I'd ever been abroad. And, you know, to go straight, of course, by train, so I mean, we were going via Belgium, Germany, Austria, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria, in fact. But getting off the train to Istanbul and, you know, exploring Istanbul was extraordinary. I mean, our teacher Roger Mills was wonderful, very liberal in the sense that he said, "Look, tomorrow I'm going to Hagia Sophia or the Blue Mosque or, you know, something like that." And he would say, "If you want to come with me, you can. If you don't, you can do what you like." So we were left free, you know, and sometimes we went around with him, sometimes we just, you know, went off.
You were 16 years old, something like that?
Yeah, 16 years old, and we were exploring. We even went to nightclubs and in fact, even to a striptease show. And even went to, this place that Theotokos talks about in Leonis, I think it was called Arbanozi or something. It's this, it was, in English, it's called the Street of a Thousand Whores. And not that I went into any of the whorehouses, but you know, it was quite educative at the age of 16, walking up and down the street, seeing these prostitutes in their doorways and their windows. You know, it was quite.
It's quite of an experience for
it was. You know, for somebody who'd been in a single-sex school, you know, coming from, you know, fairly, what can I say, not quite puritanical background, but you know, sex wasn't something that was ever talked about at home, for instance. You know. Anyway, so then we went by boat from Istanbul to Smyrna, to Izmir, and from there we went to Ephesus. We made a lovely trip to Ephesus, and from there we went by boat to Piraeus. So that was the first time I'd seen Greece. And I should say that which boat did we go on from Izmir to Piraeus? It was a boat belonging to Titalvos lines called the Mediterranean. And it was a sister ship of the Angelica, which were, both of these boats were paddle steamers. You know, they had these big wheels built in Glasgow in 1900, and they were being used by Titalvos lines to take people around the Aegean. The Angelica was actually used in the film of Zorba the Greek, by Kakougiannis. This was the sister ship Mediterranean, which was the same. So that, even that was an experience, you know, going across the Aegean on a paddle steamer, which even in those days was already 60 something years old. And then the first thing I noticed, actually, when the boat was getting near to Piraeus, and we're getting near into the harbour, I think the first word of Greek that I saw was
Modern Greek.
First word of Greek I saw in Greece. It was a neon illuminated sign, Philips. But it was in, in the Greek alphabet.
It was in the Greek
alphabet. And of course,
alphabet.
Having known in early ancient Greek, I could read it, and I thought it was very amusing. The first word of Greek that I could see in Greece was a foreign marca, which of course is something which continues to go on today. But going from there, none of my teachers at school had ever told me that Greek was still being spoken. And I don't think any of us ever asked, actually, are there still Greeks there speaking Greek? So I have no idea about what sort of language the Greeks were speaking now. It was all classics. And so, there I see the Greek alphabet being used for a, Dutch company name. I think this is interesting, this is modern. And then, I start seeing street signs in the town, in the city, newspaper headlines and things, and I can understand some of it, Of course, not everything, because the word stasis, as you know, in ancient Greek, means a revolution. Whereas in modern Greek, it's a bus stop. So I would see these words stasis around and wondering why they were putting up propaganda for a revolution. It took me some time to realise what was going on. But I could read the letters. And being a kind of what they would now call a geek, I suppose, I was a Greek geek or a geek Greek. I was very into books and dictionaries and grammars and things. So I bought myself a couple of phrase books, modern Greek phrase books, actually even before I went, and tried to work out some of this language, which I found very, very difficult sometimes. I mean, I could understand a lot of it, but some of it was very difficult. For instance, the things that I really found difficult were nabo, navro, and I learned that you had to pronounce them like that, but I couldn't understand what on earth did this come from until I realised that they came from the ancient Greek verb, which in those days I pronounced as bino, in other words, veno, because of course we use the Erasmian pronunciation.
The Erasmian pronunciation.
Yeah, of course. I mean, everyone did. I mean, no one had even heard of anything except the Erasmian pronunciation in England in those days, at least not at school. And so that was what got me interested, and even though when I was 16 it never occurred to me to go on to study modern Greek, I started teaching myself from then on. Buying books and things, and I even bought a copy of Solomos's poems, which is rather difficult modern Greek to begin with, for a beginner. And then when I went to Greece again, because I went to Greece again in 1965, I bought a copy of Seferis's poems, and actually now it turns out that this is the last edition of his poems that he himself edited, because after he died, they were edited by Savidis, and actually I won't go into details here, but there are some differences in the way that the poems are presented, and I prefer I prefer the editions that Seferis himself edited.
And which edition of Solomos have you bought?
Oh, it was a very bad edition by Ekdosis Mari. They were the sort of things probably that were sold off, Kara in the streets of Athens, the sort of things where you open it and all the pages fall out,
It's an
but
old
I still have it.
It's
It's undated, I suppose it dates from the 50s or the 60s. But that was my first book, was Solomos, and the first book I bought was actually in London. And then I finished school. I did my exams that's A level, which is the equivalent to the Apolitirio, but of course in England you do it only in a small number of subjects. So I did it in Latin, ancient Greek, ancient history, and French. And I emphasize French because then I went to university, to Oxford. I got a place to read law, and I thought I'd finished with classics. I didn't really want to do any more classics. I'd been doing it for several years, and I started doing law. Really because my father thought it was a good idea, and I didn't have anything against it. I thought, why not? I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea.
No particular preferences or interests?
But I always liked languages, and during that first year studying law, I came to be totally bored, both by law and by the teacher. He was a very bad teacher, our tutor in our college. There were 5 students in that year reading law in St John's College, and it's interesting that 2 out of those 5 dropped out. 2 out of those 5 dropped out of law at the end of the first year. One of them went to do English literature, and I went off to do modern languages. So I was looking around during that year. I thought, I must get out of this, I must get out of this. I didn't want to leave Oxford, but I wanted to leave law. So I asked around, I spoke to lots of people, friends, tutors. I went to see tutors that I didn't know, you know, the modern Greek tutor, the French tutor, asking them. And they said, well, since you've got French A-level, then you can do 2 languages, 2 modern languages. French and modern Greek, because with classical Greek you can learn modern Greek quite easily, which is true. Then so that's what I did for the rest of my Oxford career. So I got my degree in modern languages, that is French and modern Greek.
And then you also, during your studies, you came to Greece again.
That's right.
As a fellow.
No, well, I'll explain. I went there under 3 different ways actually. So I completed my first year at Oxford studying law. Now, I didn't want to spend any more time studying at Oxford because it would have meant that somebody would have had to pay for an extra year. See, obviously the state paid me for my 3 years, but they wouldn't have paid for a 4th. So I decided, after having done 1 year of modern languages, that is after the end of my 2nd year, that I'd go off to Greece for a year. I would take a break in my studies, go off to Greece, pay for everything myself, which I did, and then come back afterwards and get my degree after, if you like, my 4th year, but only 3 years in Oxford, 1 year in Athens. So I went to Athens, and in the meantime I was very lucky because on that trip in 1965 I'd met somebody who's been a friend ever since, a man called Spiros Spiromilios, who's descended from the famous General Spiromilios of the War of Independence. And he had studied at an English public school and Cambridge University, and spoke and still does the most beautiful old-fashioned English. Got a wonderful English accent. He was married to a Scottish lady who also became a friend of mine. He ran a tourist company called the Agener Club, and I worked for him for 2 summers, in the summer of '65 and the summer of '66, on Peloponnesian tours. I was the synodos. I wasn't allowed to call myself a xenagos because you had to have a license, but I would just accompany, you know, sitting in the front seat next to the driver, accompany the tourists, you know, give them a little talk through the microphone before we got to this archaeological site, and then leave it, of course, to the professional guides to do the guiding. So we did these archaeological tours around the Peloponnese, which was great fun, and that was for 2 summers. And then in '66, after that summer, I decided to spend this year in Athens, still, as it were, as an undergraduate from Oxford, and I taught English in Athens. But for the first few months, I was able to stay in a flat belonging to Spiros. It was a flat which was used by his employees who used to come for the summer, for the tourist season. But in the winter, I was allowed to stay there. I paid him rent, but only a very small rent, and then I found my own accommodation when the spring came and the others came out. But Spiros was very helpful to me in all sorts of ways and introduced me to lots of people. But it was during that year, I mean that year in Greece, that first year in Greece was absolutely kathoristikos for me. You know, it was a defining moment in my intellectual development, in my studies, because there I got to know the Greek language well, I got to know a lot of Greeks, I got to know the country in general. I had a car, I was very privileged. I taught English for 70 drachmas an hour, which was like £1, And that was enough for me to work just for, say, 3 days a week, and I could spend the rest of the time reading, studying, and going around in my car, going to beaches and deserted beaches in the middle of the week when everybody was at work, and it was a wonderful time.
Seems you enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it very much, and for the first few months, from say September, October '66 to April, and I'll come back to April '67. I went to the Panepistimiaki Leski in Hippocrates, and I studied modern Greek. I did modern Greek lessons with Davignotis, who later became the famous professor. He was actually
He
was actually a very, very good teacher, very, very good teacher, and very, very nice. I mean, I've since, we've parted ways, and I've fallen out with him, and I don't have any contact with him nowadays. But in those days, he was actually a very, very good teacher, and he was teaching us Dimotiki as well. Not Katharevose, we were doing Dimotiki.
And you learned Greek.
So with his help, and with just being in Greece.
Being in country.
But then when the colonel's coup happened on the 21st, and I'll come back to that, 21st of April, then people who were not registered at Athens University were no longer allowed to go to the Panepistimiaki Leski, so I stopped going to those classes, unfortunately. But of course, yes, one of the most important things that happened during the time, one of the most important things that happened to me during that first year of mine in Athens was the colonel's coup on the 21st of April. And as it happened, on that day, a friend of mine, a Lebanese theology student at Athens University called Michel, he and I were booked on the railway to go by train from Athens to Istanbul on the 21st of April. And we were going to go to visit Istanbul for Easter, Constantinople. And anyway, the coup happened. I woke up in the morning. I was living then in Pankrati. Turned on the radio as I used to get the news, and I heard these Envatiria and Zimotka Tragudia, and then these things were punctuated every so often by an official voice saying something like, in view of the internal and external threat to the security of our country, the king has decided, or something like that, or I have decided, signed the king, to suspend the following articles of the Constitution, and there is a curfew. You're not allowed to go out of the house. You must stay at home, etc., etc. And I thought this is strange.
You could follow the language at that stage.
Of course.
Yeah. You were fluent.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Anyway, the first thing I did was to go out of the house. What do you do? And especially in Greece, I mean, who's going to obey these orders? So I went to the peripteron and said, I didn't have a phone in the flat. And I said, what's going on? And the guy at the peripteron said, katastasi polemo. I said, polemo? Polemos? Όχι ακριβώς. He said, Hunda. Τι να σου πω, Hunda. And I didn't really know what Hunda was, but anyway, I then said, well, I said to him, are the railways working today? He said, railways? Τα τρένα. And obviously not. And I wanted to phone my parents to tell them. Well, first of all, I wanted to phone my friend Michel because we were supposed to be meeting to go on the train to Istanbul. The phones weren't working, of course. I went to the local Ote office. They were closed. To phone, they were closed. The post office was closed. So I decided to walk to my friend Michel, who lived in Kolonaki. So I walked kind of, I suppose, I actually walked through Sindagma. And of course there were one or two tanks outside the Vuli, pointing downwards towards the square, and soldiers at corners, very few people in the streets. Except I remember some American tourists going around the jewellery shops near Sindagma and asking each other, why are these shops closed? What's going on? They didn't seem to have noticed the tanks there. And I just kept walking, and actually no soldier stopped me. And I got to my friend, and we had lunch together. Anyway, the fact was that the trains were working the next day, so we actually went to Istanbul the next day. But it was an extraordinary situation, and I spent that night of the 21st to the 22nd with friends, with Michelle and with some Greek friends. And I remember this was somewhere up high in Kononaki near the Gymnasio. It was Anapiron Polemu, somewhere like that. And this friend who had the flat, I can't even remember his name now, he was very amused that there was a soldier out in the street after dark, you know, stopping people. Well, he was there to stop people if anybody was out because of the curfew. Of course, there was no traffic. And this friend was going out and joking. He was kind of shouting at the policeman and trying to make him scared. And I just remember when occasionally somebody would go by, there were sometimes cars going by, this friend of mine would shout to him, "Fatone!" to the soldier, just to sort of wind him up. Of course the soldier didn't shoot, but he looked very scared. So, and then the next day we left, but it was very interesting going to Istanbul. Oh, first of all, going to Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki station, where we had to change, was absolutely full of people. It was like, you know, people trying to get out. They were trying to get on trains to go to Yugoslavia, of course, and Bulgaria, whatever, just to get out of Greece. And then very few people on the train from Thessaloniki to Istanbul. And when we got to Istanbul, my friend Michel had an introduction to the Patriarch of Constantinople, Athenagoras. So on one of the days of Easter, like whether it was Easter Saturday or whatever, we went to visit him. And he was very friendly, and we, you know, Tsumrisa me avra, I can't know who won, but somehow by going to the church, by going to the Patriarchate, we also met a lot of the local Romius. Who were very friendly to us because they wondered where we'd come from, what we were doing. When we said we'd just come from Greece, we became the most popular people in Istanbul. They were inviting us to their houses all the time because they wanted to know what's it like, what's going on. Somebody told us that they'd heard or read somewhere in a Turkish newspaper that the king had been publicly executed in Sendagma Square. I mean, all sorts of strange rumours going around. So we were able to say, well, as far as we knew, this wasn't the case. And anyway, so that was very interesting. I'm talking too long about that one year, but I mean, it was very educative. By the time I got back to Greece, of course, it was very interesting for an Englishman to be living under a military dictatorship, because it was something which I'd never thought I would ever experience. And I knew a lot of writers, and actually it was when I went back again, because after the summer of '67 I went back to Oxford. I did my last year as an undergraduate, finished my degree.
You finished it.
I then started an MPhil degree in comparative literature, that's French and modern Greek, and then halfway through that, in the summer of '69, I was appointed to a so-called travelling fellowship by Queen's College at Oxford, which allowed me to go off to Greece for 2.5 years at the expense of Queen's College, Oxford. And so I spent 2.5 years from '69 to '72.
For your thesis?
That was when I was working on my doctoral thesis, which was about the Greek novel of the Mesopolemos, of the integral period. And so I was able to meet those novelists who are still alive from that period. Kosmas Politis, who was and still is my favourite Greek novelist, very interesting man. Angelos Terzakis, Thanasis Petsalis, Panderis Prevelakis, who I actually became quite friendly with. Unfortunately, other authors had already died. Minivilis Theotokos had died, although I got to know Theotokos' widow, Koralea, who became a very, very close friend of mine and of Jackie's when we got together.
Tsirkas?
Well, younger people, yes. He was one of the younger writers. He was younger than the generation of 1930, just about. Tsirkas I got to know very well. And even better, I got to know Kostas Taxis, who became a very close friend. And then younger still, you know, I kind of see myself as a sort of honorary member of the Yaniatou Evdomina, because I knew all those people in those days, and it was very exciting because it was at the time and they were just beginning to publish. So Yanis Kondos, Nasios Vagenas, Lefteris Poulios, Vasilis Teriadis, Jenny Mastoraki, Who else?
Rook, Katerina.
Katerina Angelaki Rook was slightly older.
Mhm.
She wasn't Yeniatu Ezominda, but she became my closest friend then in Greece, and she still is today.
Would you like to say a few things about the intellectual climate in Greece at the time?
Yeah.
What sorts of things people were interested? It was the
Yeah.
junta years.
Yeah.
It was very difficult.
Well, it was in that second period in Greece.
Mhm.
When I was a graduate student from Queen's College, Oxford, doing my research, that I really got into the Greek
Into the Greek
intellectual scene.
Also, how do you choose this?
Well, that happened to be because one of my professors at Oxford, the professor, was Konstantinos Tripanis, and he was the one who suggested that I work on the novel of the
Yes, because in a
interval.
way he was also a member of.
Yeah, he was of the same generation, and he knew these people. Let's see. I met a lot of writers through two people who were very kind to me and very friendly and very helpful. One of them was Kimon Fryer, the famous Greek-American translator, and he used to have meetings every week in his flat in Kalithoromio Street, and he would gather together young writers, and that's where he used to, literally these were the whole of the Yeniatu Ethnomida. They used to gather in his flat every week, and I used to go along there as well, and they would read their new poems to each other, and Kimon would comment on them, and we would all comment on each other's. I wasn't writing poems, but I was there. And Kimon would start translating them and all that, because he was translating everybody. I mean, everybody from, the 19th century until the very latest, young people. He was amazing. And the other person who was very useful to me was Nikos Yermanakos, who was a Welsh Greek. He was born and bred in Wales, and he had gone to Oxford University a little bit before me, but he was living in Greece and with his wife and children. His wife actually was from Venezuela, she wasn't Greek. And he used to entertain people, well, he and his wife Irma used to entertain people at his house, his flat, and among these people were Thanasis Valtinos, who was a great friend of Nikos, and Tsirkas, and many others. I remember Vasilis Ziogas was often around. But many other people. I think Taxis probably I met through Nikos as well.
And this is during the dictatorship?
This was all during the dictatorship.
Yeah.
And I remember actually having long discussions with Tsirkas particularly, because, at the beginning of my stay there, nobody was publishing anything because of the preemptive censorship. And I remember saying to Tsirkas, look, I think you should publish. There was me, a young foreigner, saying to this grand man, I think you should publish because, young people, I said, look, I've got a lot of young Greek friends, and, they're all desperate to read new things. They're all hungry for new things, and I think they need your voice. They need your voice to write for them. And then, of course, obviously, the law changed, as you know, at the end of 69 or 70, anyway, whatever, when it was no longer preemptive censorship, but they could always put you in prison, of course, afterwards, but you could publish the books. And then, Zekakto Kimena came along and all that. So, of course, I was very pleased when that happened, because I thought, at last, these people are publishing. And I suppose I knew a lot of the people who were in the Zekakto Kimena and the Nea Kimena. And I met Tsirkas. Oh yes, how I met Tsirkas. I met Ritsos. How I met Ritsos. I said I got quite friendly with Prevelakis. Now Prevelakis is usually associated, I think, in people's minds, maybe yours, with conservatism, right wing, whatever it is. Actually, he wasn't really that right wing. He had flirted with communism in his youth, although that doesn't mean anything. A lot of people do. But he was very fond of Tsirka. I keep saying Tsirka. He was very fond of Ritsos. They were born in the same year, which actually was the year that my father was born, which I think was quite interesting for me. 1909, and Prevelakis saw Ritsos as being a synodiporos, somebody who'd gone along some of the same road as him. Now, Ritsos at that time was under house arrest in Karlovasi in Samos, and I was planning to go to Samos anyway, where I got some friends, and I told Prevelakis I was going, and he said, well, when you go, please go to Ritsos, and please tell him that I sent you, and that I'm sending him all my love and encouragement and best wishes.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very touched by that, of course, myself, because I thought, Prevelakis and Ritsos, they don't seem to come from the same political camp. They don't, of course. But as you probably know, after was it after Ritsos died, Prevelakis wrote a whole book about Ritsos,
Yes.
and he said rather jokingly that he was probably the only person in the world apart from Ritsos who had read every word that Ritsos had ever written. It's quite a good book. And so I did go and see Ritsos there, and he was very friendly and welcoming, and I gave him Prevelakis this message, which was then, of course, returned and reciprocated. So I used to go and see Ritsos. Once he was then in Athens, I used to go and see him there. I was, of course, very conscious of the intellectual resistance against the colonels, but I wasn't actually part of it myself. And although I didn't know anybody who was actually in prison at the time, because of course I arrived, in '69 to do my research, the colonels had already been there for 2.5 years. There were already people in prison. But I do remember meeting in Egina once with some friends, 3 very nice ladies who were visiting Egina because their husbands were in prison. One of them was the wife of Dimitris Maronitis, one of them was the wife of Pavlos Zanas, and the other one I now can't remember. But anyway, when Maronitis came out of prison, when Zanas came out of prison, I was there at the time, and I met them through their wives, because I got to know their wives. I got to know them, and of course, so although I didn't know people who were in prison at night, I knew people once they'd come out of prison, so of course I was very much sympathetic to their sufferings, to their outlook, and to what they're doing, etc. But I wasn't involved in any kind of activity myself. I was also very aware of the way that some people like Kostas Taktsis and Kate Tsitseli, Kate became a great friend of mine as well, were very much criticised because they accepted money from the Ford Foundation during the Colonel's period, which gave them enough money to go to America, and I think Kostas Taktsis even bought a flat with this money that he got from the Ford Foundation. So they were accused by people on the left of betrayal, if you like, and so I was very, very much sort of aware of these things. I also knew Eli Alexiou, who seems to have been free. I don't think she was under house arrest. She may have been arrested right at the very beginning, but by the time I was there in '69, she was living a normal life in her flat. Of course, she'd been living in East Germany, I suppose, or was it Hungary? Anyway, behind the Iron Curtain.
East Germany.
East Germany. And I also met her friend, the critic, whose name I now can't remember, sorry, it's disappeared from my mind. He was known as Oyatros. Marcos Avieris, who was really called Yorgos Papadopoulos, just like the dictator, but Marcos Avieris was his pseudonymous. I met him, and quite a lot of associates of Eli Alexiou. Eli was very helpful to me. I went to see her because of the research on my thesis. So I met a lot of people through her, but I also met I met through Yanis Kondos. I met Kanelopoulos, for instance, some of the politicians.
You also did some editing for the Historia του Ελληνικού Έθνους.
Yes.
Was it considered to be a big project at the time?
Well, it was, yes. This was when, you see, I returned to Oxford in '72, and I finished off my thesis, and that was that. And then after I'd done that, I didn't know what to do, so I still didn't have any idea of what career I had in mind. I went back to Greece in January of '73, and I was prepared to stay there indefinitely. I knew that I could find work, which I did, just part-time work,
Teaching,
freelance work. Not much teaching, but a bit of translating, a bit of editing, a bit of... I even worked as a consultant for an advertising agent because my father was an advertising agent, and I'd worked in my father's office for a year actually. I found an advertising agent who I met seemed to think that it was good for his clients if he had a young Englishman who knew all about the latest advertising techniques in England who could come along and advise him. And he used to pay me quite well for that, and I used to say very little. But one of the jobs I got was with Exotic Athinon, and this was a job I found through Philip Sherrard, who I'd got to know and became friendly with. He was actually organising the translation of the first few volumes of the Historia Tuerini Questions into English. And in fact, some of those volumes were published in English, although I don't think it proceeded beyond a certain point. So at that time, when I was there, I'm talking about 73. Okay. At that time, they were already quite far advanced in the Greek edition. They were already producing. They were already publishing volumes about the Hellenistic period, and afterwards, I think Byzantine, etc. But in English, they were publishing the very early ones, the prehistory. So I was translating some of the only very small parts of the prehistory sections for the English version, because there were a whole team of translators. I was just one of many. But I was also helping with some copy editing of the Greek version, and that meant going to the Archeologia Archeteria and looking up references in the library there. That was very interesting, and checking people's references and reading through their... Not that I wasn't correcting their Greek, of course, but I was correcting some factual things that I was finding out. So it was quite nice. I was entrusted to do this sort of research work by the company. And Exotica Athinon seemed to have a lot of money. I don't know where it came from, I never asked. But the people there were very friendly. There was Yanis Bastias, who was the son of Kostas Bastias, and a man called Christopoulos. They were the guys in charge. But the most interesting thing for me about working for Exotic Athinon, as I say, it wasn't a full-time job in any way, it was just freelance. I used to go to the office just to hand over work, to collect money, but I didn't spend very long there. I was working at home generally. The most interesting aspect was that I met some young historians who were also working, but they were working probably, full-time for Exotic Athinon at the time.
Like Veremis.
There was Thanos Veremis, Yanis Koliopoulos, and Miltos Chatzopoulos, who became a Roman historian, as you know, whereas the other two, of course, are famous for their modern history. And although I don't see Miltos much nowadays, I do see Thanos and even Yanis Koliopoulos, who, as you know, has been very unwell for some time, but I occasionally manage to get to see him in Thessaloniki, and he's a very dear friend, a very dear person. I'm very, very fond of him and his wife, Christina. They're among our best friends in Greece. So, some of these friendships go back to that time. And now...
early 70s.
73, that's right, which is 40 years plus. But also during those periods, of course, I met a lot of Greek friends, who are not necessarily involved in literature or whatever, and I still see them, now, which is great. And I sometimes feel that I've got more friends in Greece than I have in Britain.
So shall we turn to your working career? Would you like to say a few things about your first job, how it came up? Yeah.
Well, my first job was at King's College London, and it came up through Philip Sherrard, whose name I've already mentioned. Philip lived between Greece and London, and at that time, in fact, he had got a job as lecturer in the history of the Orthodox Church at King's College London. He was the first and only holder of this post, and he was only there for a few years. But he was one of the people with Richard Clogg. Richard Clogg was also there at the time. He had just started, excuse me, as lecturer in modern Greek history. And Richard and Philip became good friends as well as colleagues. Friends between themselves. But I had already met both of them. And they, I think, were the ones who decided to try to get a new post set up at King's in modern Greek literature. And so that post was set up, it was advertised while I was in Greece. And Philip wrote to me or told me in some way that this job was coming up, and he hoped that I would apply. I applied, I came to London, was interviewed, and I was appointed starting in October. I was already living in Greece, so I went back to Greece and stayed there, I suppose, until September, and at which point I came back to England. And I had that job at King's College London for 7.5 years, and I set up all the courses in modern Greek language and literature, because the post hadn't existed before.
What did you teach?
What did I teach? Well, I taught practically everything. I mean, I taught language and I taught literature, and I taught the whole thing. From Solomos to the present day, I suppose, in literature. And it was quite difficult. I mean, I had quite a lot of teaching hours, as I continue to have at Oxford as well. But we managed to find a teaching assistant, a Greek who did the practical language work, but she was only working part-time. But anyway, I very much enjoyed working with Philip Sherard and Richard Clogg. When I say working with, we were in the same department, but Richard Clogg certainly was teaching modern Greek history to the same students that I was teaching language and literature to. Philip Sherard, because he was doing history of the Orthodox Church, well, he had his own students, they were not the students that I was teaching. And it was during that time, I should explain that when I was appointed in London, it was a joint appointment. It was supposed to be half paid by King's College and half paid by the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And it was at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies that I met Jackie, who later became my wife, and I met her at the my first Christmas party of the School of Slavonic Studies. And she was working there in the administration, in the secretarial office. She was secretary of the Russian department, and she studied Russian. So we've been together now for 30 years. 40 years, I'm sorry. So that was my great gain from being at the School of Slavonic Studies, although I didn't actually teach many people there. Most of my courses were done at King's College. So my social activities were more at the School of Slavonic Studies, and my teaching was at King's College.
And your students were Brits, Greeks?
Well, there were three categories, I suppose. There were people who were totally non-Greek. There were people from Greece or Cyprus, and then, of course, there were London Cypriots as well. That is, children of Cypriot parents who, spoke English really. Or rather, their English was better than their Greek because all their schooling was done in English. But they spoke Greek at home to their parents and their grandparents or whatever. So it's quite interesting trying to put all these together and trying to make some sense out of how do you pitch especially the language teaching. Of course, was difficult with three completely different categories of people. Anyway, I wasn't terribly happy about King's College. Somehow I felt, being an Oxford graduate, I was thinking it would be rather nice to go back to Oxford or perhaps Cambridge. And then when this job came up at Oxford, when my modern Greek tutor Robin Fletcher retired, I applied for the job and I was appointed here in Oxford at the beginning of 1981, so in January 1981, that's when I left King's. And Jackie, although she didn't know Oxford, she never lived in Oxford, she came with me. We moved house from London to Oxford, into this house here that we're sitting in now, in 1981, and we've never regretted having moved from London, actually. I mean, we go to London quite frequently, but we like it here in Oxford. It's a very nice environment. And here, I think, at least in the first few years, I found the teaching environment was easier. I seemed to have to do fewer hours of work. I was very lucky to find already in post a language teaching assistant, Mary Colton, who was half Greek and half Scottish, and she was appointed, in fact, just one term, a few months before me, and she continued all the way through my career here. She was my only close colleague, in fact, and we worked together a lot, and we became friends, and she was absolutely wonderful. So she did. She was very, very good at the. She did the language side of things, and I did the literature.
You also did the history. You
Yes,
introduced the history course.
During that period, so from 81 till 2000, I actually took early retirement at the age of 2003. During that period, I suppose, let's say around about the mid-90s, perhaps before, the early 90s, I decided I would bring in a new obligatory course, compulsory course for first-year students on modern Greek history. It was actually history of the 20th century. And since there was nobody else around to teach it, I had to teach it myself. But I thought, you know, when you're studying French or German, it's fairly easy to pick up French or German history if you want to. And anyway, perhaps it's not so important to reading the literature anyway. But if you're reading modern Greek literature, you've got to know about the history. You know, how do you read Solomos? How do you read Papadiamanis? How do you read Seferis, etc., etc.? How do you read these people without knowing the history?
The historical context.
And so that I introduced that and I taught that. But I also introduced a course for classicists, in other words, for students who were not my own students, but they were classic students, who used to come to me and study modern Greek poetry. So I was doing Seferis and Kalafi with these classicists, and I felt this was very good. They were very good students. It was very stimulating for me. I learned a lot from them. And I should say, actually, I've learned a lot in general from my students. I mean, one's students are, especially graduate students, so the people that one learns most from, perhaps. And also, many of my graduate students became friends and have remained friends and are still friends today. Many of them, of course, are Greeks, but some of them are not. And because of the fact that modern Greek is such a small subject, those of us who are teaching it in Britain, and that was only really at 4 universities, Birmingham, Cambridge, King's College London and Oxford, we decided in 1981, in fact the initiative came from Margaret Alexiou in Birmingham, we decided to form a committee that tried to coordinate somehow modern Greek studies in Britain. I mean, each university of course had its own curriculum, its own syllabus, but we tried to put on, or we did put on, some joint events. So every year we put on 2 joint events with the 4 universities combined, and people from other universities who were interested as well, both teachers and students. One of these was an undergraduate course, which would be a weekend. It was called the Greek Weekend. And the other one was a postgraduate colloquium for postgraduate students to give papers. And this was great fun. We really enjoyed doing these things. It was great to be able to teach students from other universities, to meet students from other universities, and of course it was great for the students to be taught by teachers from other universities too, because generally the students were being taught by one person or 2 people, and that was it.
So this was something like a forum for modern Greek studies in
That's right, and we would also have meetings, just the teachers, exchange ideas and information, etc. But also, going back to friendship with graduate students, I also made friends with a lot of graduate students who were not my graduate students, but graduate students at other universities who are still friends of mine today. And also in Oxford, I was lucky enough because, although I said nobody was teaching modern Greek history at undergraduate level, there was John Campbell here, who was trained as an anthropologist, and he was also a historian, and he had a lot of very good graduate students. And he was, I met a lot of his students and a lot of other Greek graduate students, especially historians, who were studying in Oxford, who have remained friends of mine. So, I mean, some of my best friends in Greece include Charis Vladianos, Dimitris Livanios, Vasilis Gounaris, Thanos Verems, of course, had been here as well. But that's before I came here to teach. But there are quite a few Greek historians who are now teaching in Greek universities, who I met because they were studying in Oxford, not with me, but with John Campbell or somebody else, and who I met and became friends with. And it was very useful, actually, my wife, because my wife was here working at St Anthony's College, which is where John Campbell was, and it's also where Richard Clogg went when John Campbell retired.
So, would you say that these were the years that modern Greek studies as a field was actually formed in Britain, and
yeah, I think so. Well, it was
a growing community
it was
of
flourishing. It was flourishing.
British-trained
I mean, as you know, there's nobody teaching modern Greek history. There's nobody with a post in modern Greek history at any British university now.
Yes.
Whereas in the past there was the one at London and there was the one at Oxford. The post at Oxford, though, was only it's too difficult to go into details, but the holder of the modern Greek post at St Anthony's was not actually, he didn't have any teaching duties in the university at undergraduate level. So John Campbell and Richard Clogg both supervised postgraduate students, but they didn't teach at undergraduate level, so there was no proper programme in modern Greek history, but at least they had these graduate students, and they were, almost every single graduate student that they had was, one of the top, among the top people, the sort of names that I mentioned. Mark Mazur was another one, who did modern Greek history here with John Campbell. And Michael Hertzfeldt did anthropology with him, people who have become world famous in their fields. So it was a great time, and somehow, yes, modern Greek studies seem to be flourishing in a way that they're not now. I don't think there was more, there was not more interest in the sense that there were no more undergraduates then than there are now. It was always a very, very small number of people, and I think from the time that I arrived here at Oxford in '81 to the time that I left, and even to now, I think it's been more or less the same number of undergraduates. It's a very small number.
If it's not a question of numbers, what is it about? Why has it declined now?
It's very difficult to say. At the time when I started doing modern Greek, just teaching modern Greek at King's, that was a wonderful time because it was the time of the colonels, because people were interested in Greece. They were interested in contemporary Greece. What was happening in Greece
politics
was. It was one of the places where the future of European democracy was being decided. It was a crucial place. Like we're all interested in Ukraine now and all that. People were interested in Greece at that time, and even after that, the sort of it took a long time for that interest in Greece to subside. And with Seferis having got the Nobel Prize in '63 and Elitis getting the Nobel Prize in whatever it was '79, this interest still continued for some years afterwards. But unfortunately, this interest has really gone down tremendously nowadays. My colleague, I should say, my successor, Dimitris Papanikolaou, who teaches modern Greek here now in Oxford. He has a very good group of, a very lively group of undergraduates and graduate students. The numbers haven't changed, and the students, I'm sure, are just as good as they were. I'm talking about the general interest, sort of outside the actual subject of modern Greek. The sort of general interest in the university and in the public at large. It is nice at the moment. Maybe I don't know whether you've travelled on the London Underground in the last few days, but. There is something called Greek Poems on the Underground at the moment, because Greece holds the presidency of the European Union. They've actually got, on underground trains, they've got some Greek poems, ancient Greek and modern Greek. And I saw, when I was in London the other day, I saw something of Sappho, and then there's something of Kavafis as well, Ionikon, in Greek and in English. Which is very nice, so that raises the profile of Greek. So it's nice to know that there are people around outside Greek studies who are interested in modern Greek things.
Might be the crisis as well.
Yes, now the crisis,
of course. Yes, that's right. There's a tremendous
introduces Greece.
There is a tremendous sympathy for Greece, in Britain, among certain people. And then among other certain people, of course, there's no sympathy.
Yes, of course.
But I don't think I want to talk about that because that's not my
Shall we discuss your research and publications?
Yes.
Perhaps.
Yeah, you see, when you asked me to kind of prepare my thoughts in advance about this kind of topic. I find it very difficult because some people, you know, are the world experts in X. You know, they have written books and articles all about this one X, and sometimes this X is very big, of course. In my case, there are a lot of tiny little X's and nothing really big, because I've written about language, that is practical language, you know, grammar. I've also written about linguistics, and particularly sociolinguistics, and then from that, you know, things like language ideology, language myths, as they call them, and of course the language question, the glossicositema, language ideologies, linguistic nationalism, that kind of thing. But of course, I've done literature, and I have done a little bit of history as well. But history, my publications on history have all been to do with sort of development of nationalist ideology, really. So, you know, I have published chapters or articles in the last few years about, you know, sort of Greek, what can I say, Greek attitudes to the difference between their own culture and other people's cultures. You know, why are the Greeks different from others? You know, that kind of ideology. But as you know, I mean, I've concentrated in the last few years particularly on the history of the language question.
The glossia.
And the glossia. And in fact, I'm continuing to publish about these things. But it's not all just the glossia, it's not all the Δημοτική Καθαρεύουσα, because one of my publications that is just about to be published is something, it's a chapter in a book edited by a young scholar called Vali Litra. And she has got a volume together which is about Greek, I think it's called Greek-Turkish Encounters. Anyway, it's to do with encounters between Greeks and Turks and between Greek and Turkish cultures. And I've got a chapter in there about attitudes by Greeks to Turkish words and other Turkish linguistic material in Greek. What sort of attitudes do Greeks have to all these Turkish words that are in Greek, like kalendi and kefi and chavales and all these words that are often used, you know, used every day. I won't go into details about it because, you know, people will be able to read it eventually when it comes out. But that's the sort of thing I'm interested in, not just the language itself from a grammatical point of view, but also people's attitudes to the language. And of course the attitudes to the language were very much behind the language question, the glossicositema, which for me is one of the most important and fascinating aspects of what is called the making of modern Greece, you know, the history of the Greek nation and state from the late 18th century onwards. But I think it's also symptomatic of what I see as a very negative aspect of Greek intellectual history, and that is this delusion, if you like, that Greeks are some kind of special case, that they are a chosen people, you know, like the Jews are, that there's something intrinsically superior about Greeks, and something intrinsically superior about the Greek language. You know, I think this has been tremendously, this has had a tremendously bad effect in Greece, and I think it may have something to do with the causes behind the present crisis, but I won't go into details about that because this is just hypothesis. But I think the language question to me is a sort of symptom of an unwillingness by some Greeks at least, often some leading Greeks, to face up to reality. You know, in this case it was facing up to the reality of the modern Greek language and modern Greece, and trying to see modern Greece through the prism of ancient Greece always. You know, this glorious history and all that, and then, you know, the modern Greeks having this glorious history could be very proud of themselves, which actually meant that they didn't really need to make much of a mark in the world themselves because they had the ancestors who had already done it for them. And I think this was actually negative in the sense that it was debilitating. I think a lot of Greeks probably felt, well, what could we do when our ancestors who were so brilliant, we can't possibly surpass them, so, you know, what are we going to do? And I think, you know, although it's very nice to be made proud of your ancestors, in a way, you can become too proud of your ancestors, and it can be confining intellectually and everything else, and it can confine your originality. I mean, I remember reading some recently. I wish I had the quote in front of me. An Englishman writing about England, not about Greece, saying, you know, people talk about we're proud of our ancestors. Why should we be proud of our ancestors? I mean, you know, why should we be proud of what people did generations ago? What's that got to do with us? You know, we should try and do things that we can be proud of ourselves, not proud of ancestors. So, you know, it's not only confined to Greece, of course, this pride in ancestors. It's quite a universal phenomenon, I suppose. But I think in Greece it went rather too far.
Do you think that it was also non-Greeks that expected from Greeks to be the direct descendants of the ancients?
Yes, of course it was, because obviously the rediscovery of ancient Greece by the Greeks themselves coincided with the Greek Enlightenment, which, as we know from Paskalis Ketomelidis and others, you know, was the great movement that led up to the revolution, the War of Independence, and you know, it could be said that without the discovery of the Greeks, of the ancient Greeks, the revolution might not have happened. But I'm talking not so much about just being proud of the ancestors. I'm talking about, I'm not talking about only this interest that modern Greek intellectuals have had in the ancient Greeks. I'm talking about when it becomes an excessive interest and becomes an obsession, almost sort of paranoia. You know, it's very difficult to define, but clearly, when modern Greeks did start to discover the ancient Greeks in a big way, not just a few intellectuals, but, you know, the whole nation, as it were, beginning to understand about the ancient Greeks and the fact that the modern Greeks were descended from them. I'm talking about around about the year 1800. Clearly, it must have been a great positive incentive as well. You know, it made them more keen, more eager to become independent from the Ottoman Empire, because they felt this pride in their ancestry. They felt that they also felt a shame in the fact that they were slaves to the Ottomans, you know, and that they deserved a better future. So that it did give them a positive incentive to fight against the Ottomans. But unfortunately, in language, it was something which really held things back. And I remember when I was working with Richard Clogg in the 1970s, and with other colleagues from London. I should have said I was working on a project on the origins of Balkan literary languages in the 19th century. And I remember noticing how, in the middle of the 19th century, you know, Romanians could be writing quite realistic short stories and novels, quite realistic plays, dramas and that sort of thing, at the time when Greeks were hardly writing anything that was realistic, right in the middle of the 19th century. Because they were all sort of taken over by this, you know, nationalist ideology and the antiquity and the progony and all this sort of business. As you know, realism really only started getting into Greek literature in the 1880s. Very late, you know, compared to the rest of Europe. I mean, the Greeks were behind, and they were even behind some of the other Balkan countries in that respect. And I think it's because of this obsession with antiquity.
Yeah, you experienced the transition to Δημοτική after the Junta.
Yeah.
Was this an important, perhaps, impact on your research?
It was, yes. And I mean, when I was an undergraduate at Oxford, both my chief teachers, that's Robin Fletcher, who of course was an Englishman, and Konstantinos Troupanis, who was a Greek, they were both demoticists.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yes.
Robin Fletcher was really a very committed demoticist, and he used to give lectures on the glossicositime. In fact, it was his lectures in the 1960s that eventually inspired me to write my book about the glossicositime. And Tripanis also wrote a small
Yes.
book about the glossicositime, about Atticis and Attikismos, in fact. That was after he returned to Greece, after he was Minister of Culture in Greece. So they were both very much. They both led us students to believe that the Demotiki was and should be the natural language of Greece, you know, the genuine language of Greece, the proper language of Greece, to be used for all purposes, literature, government, you know, everything. And then, of course, I was living in Greece under the colonels, where it was all Katharevousa, and I had some interesting conversations with people I met who, some of whom were very conservative, and said that, you know, who argued against my support of the Demotiki, and said Demotiki, they would say it's like Cockney. It's like Cockney. It's all slang. You know, you're an Oxford student. You would not write in Cockney, would you, if you were writing an essay? I said, but no. Anyway, I tried to explain to them, without any success, of course, that Demotiki was nothing like Cockney. We're not talking about two completely different things. They were not comparable. It was quite a widespread idea,
Really?
actually. This propaganda that people had got in Greece, not just from the colonels, but before the colonels. I mean, generations and generations of school teachers teaching Greeks that their spoken language was corrupt, incorrect, shameful. You know, I mean, this is what I mean about the negative impact. I think it had a very negative impact on the psychology of a lot of Greeks from early childhood, when they went to school, being told, not only being told, but being beaten for using, you know, spoken language, and always being told that they had to find a kaliteri lexi.
Yes.
You know, you mustn't say miti, you must say ris. You know, well, why? You know, for God's sake. It's like in English, you know, saying to somebody you mustn't say nose, you must use the Latin word for it. You know, I mean, why? But then when the colonels fell, suddenly you got this phenomenon in Greece from being a situation of diglossia, or diglossia, diglossia, I don't even know how to pronounce it in English. It's, of course, actually, by the way, I should say that the word diglossia is, can I say this on film, is probably the only modern Greek word that has become part of the international scientific vocabulary. It was invented by Emmanuel-Roïdis, as you probably know,
Yes.
in 1883, and then it was popularised in France by Psycharis, and then from France it came to England, etc., and the rest is history. But not many people in linguistics outside Greece actually know that this word actually originated in Greece, because it's used, you know, about the whole world. But I think Greece is the only situation, even though it was one of the paradigmatic situations of diglossia until 74, it's probably the only culture where diglossia has disappeared and has been replaced by monoglossia. Because, you know, Ferguson, who wrote this article in 1959 about diglossia, and he talks about Greece, and he talks about the Arab countries, he talks about Haiti, and he, according to him, diglossia is going to be here more or less forever. You know, at least it's going to take generations. But from 1959 to 1974, it was actually only 15 years. So from 15 years after he wrote his article saying that it was here for generations in Greece, it was actually disappearing. So that's quite interesting. So this great linguist was proved wrong. And so it's very interesting for linguists to look at the Greek situation, what happened after diglossia, and how Greeks adapted themselves to the monoglossic situation. In fact, they adapted themselves quite easily and quite unproblematically. I mean, at the beginning, it was quite hair-raising to read some of the official documents that came in. You know, the encyclicals in Gikli that came out of the Greek ministries, where they were trying to write in Demotiki and they didn't really know what to do. But you know, gradually people got used to it. A lot of people made a lot of extremes. A lot of people, you know, came out with a lot of extreme forms, thinking, you know, we mustn't say e procito anymore. We must say prokitan, you know, which didn't last very long. But you know, in the middle of the 70s, people were using that, and then it settled down. But it's been very interesting to watch, to observe this, and I think that was why. Well, it was why I wrote my first book, The Modern Greek Language, which was published in 1985, because I wanted to try to capture this process of Greek going from a diglossic to a monoglossic situation, and that was the time that it was still going through that process. I mean, more or less the end of that process, really. But the time that I was doing my research on it was during that process. And the research, I always tell people, the research I did was a lot of reading, of course, a lot of reading, a lot of listening to Greek radio, watching Greek television, but also just listening in to Greek conversations. And because Greeks speak loudly, Greece is an ideal situation for linguistic fieldwork, because you can just sort of sit or stand somewhere near a group of people and you can listen to them, and you can even have a tape recorder going or a recorder without their knowing. And I used to spend a lot of time standing around Pigadakia in Ammonia, listening into people's conversations, you know, political arguments or arguments about football and that sort of thing in the late 70s and early 80s. And that was great fun. That's how that book came to be written.
You have also worked on Pontic Greek.
Yeah,
which at the time that was a pioneering aspect.
Yes, that's right.
Of
I mean,
research.
One of the things I said to myself when I started teaching in the 70s was, I'm never going to be interested in modern Greek dialects. Well, Anthony Breyer, who you must know of, who's this great professor of Byzantine studies at Birmingham, now sadly not well, but we did visit him last week, and he's still going. He is an expert on Byzantine Pontus, but by going to Pontus and studying the Byzantine buildings, remains, he also became quite knowledgeable about the history of Pontus in the Ottoman period, without being a linguist, though he wasn't a linguist. He is not a linguist. He would be telling me, because we became friends quite early on, he'd be telling me about Pontus and how fascinating it is. And because I'm interested in Turkey, my wife and I had already been going to Turkey on holidays sometimes, and we thought, oh, why not go to Pontus for a change? And also Greek, I'd heard from Greeks that, you know, people, Pondi from Greece, were going there already, beginning to go to Pontus, and they would go there, people to see, if they were very elderly, they were going to see their own homeland, or if they were younger, they were going to see the homelands of their parents or their grandparents. And they would find people there who spoke Pondiaka. And so I thought, I didn't go there in order to study Pondiaka, because I didn't really know. I thought maybe this was an exaggeration, you know, this was a sort of romantic idea that people still spoke Greek there. And Breyer didn't know much about it, but Breyer did give me some names and addresses of people to contact when we got to Trebizond, and while we were there, we met a very friendly man in the Maidan. They use the word Maidan there, as they do in Kiev, of course, meaning the main square. A shopkeeper, and I've always told people in Turkey, even at the times when Turkey and Greece did not have good relations, I've always said I do modern Greek, I teach modern Greek, just to see what their reactions are, you know. And the reactions have usually been very positive, I have to say. And, you know, people have usually expressed great, you know, friendship and brotherhood, etc. for Greeks. Anyway, so this shopkeeper in Trapezunda was one of them, and he said, do you know that there are people in villages here, near here, where they still speak Greek? And I said, well, I had heard such stories. He said, look, I have a friend who's a school teacher in one of those villages, and at the weekend, if you like, we'll go up there together. So this guy took us up there, and he introduced me to my first, you know, Greek-speaking Turks in Pontus. And I was so excited by this, you know, to meet these real-life people who were still speaking Greek, Pondiaka. I didn't know Pondiaka, so, you know, we couldn't understand very much of what we said, but they would say a few things that I can understand, and I said a few things in Greek that they could understand. And I thought, I really must do something about this because nobody's done anything about it.
Yeah.
So I then spent some time learning Pontiacal in Greece and through Greek publications, and then got a small amount of research money and went back and spent I went on 2 trips to a village near Trapezundo called Sarajos, where they all speak Greek, the whole village, all generations, and that's the normal language of communication. And I started doing field work there. Now, I couldn't take a tape recorder with me because it was too dangerous. In order to do field work in Turkey, certainly in the 80s, this is the 80s, you needed to have a permit from various authorities. And I knew that if I applied for a permit, they would say no. And if they said no, then they would be very suspicious if I was there.
Yeah.
So I thought, right, I won't apply. I went with my wife. I remember going to see a man called Odysseus Lampsidis, who was the president of the Epitropia, I think it was called Epitropia, not Epitropie, Pondiakon Marathon in Athens. Yes. And one of the things he said to me, I didn't mention that I was going with my wife, when I said, have you got any advice for me, he said, Min pate me gineka. So anyway, I took my wife, and actually it was the best thing to do because we were there as tourists, you know. Yeah. I wasn't there I didn't tell them that I was studying the language. I told them that I taught modern Greek and I was interested in the language, but I didn't say that I was working on a kind of research project.
He was very conservative.
Yeah, yeah. And so what we used to do, we used to sit around in cafes and collect information in our heads, sometimes writing things down. And then we would say to our friends, oh, we're just going off for a walk now into the hills. We'd go off into the hills with our notebook, and then we would write down as many things as we could remember we had heard from these people. And if we disagreed, my wife and I, then we would go back and ask them, you know, which was the word you said for so-and-so? Was it so-and-so? So it's not a very good way of doing field work, but anyway, it was a start. And then I abandoned that actually after these 2 visits because I wasn't getting very far. But the important thing that I discovered was that there is this thing called the Pontiaco Aparentato, the Pontic infinitive. Now, some scholars in Greece had been writing about it since the 19th century, and then modern, let's say progressive scholars in the 70s had tried to do some investigation on this. They hadn't discovered it at all in Pontiaca in Greece. Nobody had actually heard of it among the Pontic community in Thessaloniki, for instance. Nobody seemed to use this aparempato and they didn't understand it. And so therefore they assumed that it didn't exist, that it was either some kind of ideological construct, nationalist construct by some 19th century Pontians, or it was something that had existed but it had disappeared. Now I discovered that people were still using it in Turkey, and I have published about that. But actually, I have to say that some people in Greece have been very sceptical about my work in Turkey for ideological reasons which I don't understand, but they've sort of tried to be very negative about my work. Anyway, to go to the positive side, I rather abandoned the work because I didn't seem to be making any progress because I'm not a trained linguist, I've never studied linguistics, and I was waiting for some younger linguist to come along who I might be able to entice to push to go to do this work. And in fact there are now 3 people who for some years now, 3 younger scholars who have been working on Pondiaca in Turkey. One is a Greek, Ioanna Sitaridou, who teaches in Cambridge, so she's of course from Pontic family, Sitaridou. Hasan Özkan, who's a German of Turkish parentage, whose family originally comes from Pontus and was originally Greek speaking, and an Italian called Pietro Bortoni. These 3 people are all working on Pondiaca in Turkey, and I was Pondiaca as it's spoken in Turkey. And Ioanna Sitaridou particularly is working on this infinitive, which is very, very interesting and very fascinating. And she's using much more modern methods of, you know, videoing people and all that kind of thing. You know, she doesn't have to rush off into the mountains with a notebook and write down things in secret, because now, you know, with Greek-Turkish relations as they are, you know, she can go there, people are not frightened anymore to speak into a microphone or whatever, and there's no problem from the police and all that kind of thing.
Since you've been talking about your research and publications, which would be another area of research you might be interested in actually saying a few more things?
Well, there's just one little thing. It's a very, very small topic in medieval Greek grammar, but it's something where I seemed to have discovered something which then seemed interesting to quite a number of younger scholars. I won't go into big details because it's a very, very technical point, but because of the diglossia situation, you know, when we read medieval Greek, you know, the so-called zimosi grammatia, written in more or less the spoken language, there's so much influence there from ancient Greek, from the logia, paradosi, etc., that people have often thought of the medieval Greek that you find even in the Dimodi Kimena, they've thought of it as being artificial. You know, they've been very suspicious about whether it really corresponds with any kind of natural speech. But I discovered that there are some very quite strict linguistic rules in all these medieval Dimodi Kimena with respect to one particular phenomenon. And this is where I get technical. You know, in some Greek dialects they say agapo, as in standard modern Greek. In other Greek dialects they say agapose. But everywhere where they say agapose, or almost everywhere, they also say agapo. But it's not just a matter of choice. The speaker never has the choice of which to say. It's always controlled by grammatical rules. And I won't go into details of what the grammatical rules are, but it's to do with syntax. And it's to do with semantic emphasis. And I discovered the rules that are operating in medieval Greek, which are actually the same as in modern Cypriot dialect, which is how I discovered it. That means then that at least in that respect, these medieval texts are being written in a language which is bound by normal everyday spoken rules. It's not a totally artificial language at all. And what I'm hoping is that other people will also look at other phenomena and come to similar conclusions about other phenomena. There are other people in the world who are now working on this, younger scholars. So that's something I'm quite proud of, apart from the Pontic research. You wanted to know something about a book that I'm co-editing about the activities of the British Council in Greece immediately after the Second World War. I realised some years ago that I'd always thought that this was a fascinating topic, but I'd realised that nobody really has written about it, or hardly anybody has written about it. And I decided to suggest to the British School at Athens, not the British Council, that they put on a conference about the activities of the British Council in Greece between 1945 and 1955. And that conference took place 2 years ago. In fact, I managed to get David Ricks as the co-organiser, and he and I are now working on producing a volume based on the papers, but not entirely confined to the papers that were given at that conference. It was a very interesting period because I think, and I haven't found any evidence against this, I think that Greece was the place where the British Council was most active in those crucial 10 years immediately after the Second World War, at the time when the Cold War was just beginning to start, and of course the Greek Civil War was happening. I think Greece was thought to be, especially if you remember that Truman, in the Truman Doctrine in March 1947, it was actually on my first birthday, at the 12th of, not that I remember it at the time, the 12th of March 1947, the two countries that he singled out as being on the front line of the war against communism were Greece and Turkey. So Greece was considered by Britain and America to be an absolutely crucial country in those days, and that's why I think the British Council played such an important part. And also it played a much more important part then than it ever did later in Greece. And now it's just reduced to teaching English in a very kind of commercial way. It doesn't really do much of the cultural activities that it did in Greece. But in Greece, they were very lucky, very fortunate to have, or they're very clever to have some extremely good people, starting with Stephen Runciman, who, you know, the world-renowned Byzantinist, who was the director of the British Council for some time in the 40s, and his closest colleague was a man called Rex Warner, who was a classics scholar and a novelist and poet, who became a great friend of Seferis and Elitis and a large number of writers and artists who sort of congregated around the British Council and the Anglo-Ελληνική Επιθεώρηση, the journal that the Council brought out. And that period, that sort of heyday, finished in 1955, you know, when EOKA started its military campaign on the 1st of April 1955, and from then on, you know, all the Greeks involved, Severus and everybody, they all, you know, thought that, well, no, we can't really collaborate with the British anymore. I mean, I understand that absolutely, and they decided they couldn't carry on. So that's when the British Council really finished that 10-year period, finished suddenly with the outbreak of the Cypriot hostilities. But it is a very fascinating period, and I'm looking forward myself to the book coming out. There was something that I should have said before. When I say Cold War, I'm now reminded of it. The circumstances in which modern Greek studies were flourishing in this country. I mean, it was of course partly the colonel's regime which made people, as I said before, made people in Britain particularly interested in modern Greece. But I think also there was the Cold War as well. My post in London, the King's College post, was set up in 1973, and it was a new post. And I said, I think already, that I was both at King's College and at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. Now, the fact that modern Greek was part of the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies means that Greece, although it wasn't in the communist camp, because of its geographical position, was seen to bear some similarities to these other East European countries. And because, of course, again, Greece was on the front line, being a borderline country with having borders with Albania, with Yugoslavia, with Bulgaria. And I think that's one of the reasons why my post was set up. Not that I have to say that there was nobody ever put any pressure on me to do any work for the Foreign Office or anything like that. I was left absolutely free to do what I wanted. But I think that's why the post was set up, and I think that's why, you know, there continued to be a big interest in Greece, not just because of classical studies, but because, you know, the ruling class of Britain had all studied classics, as it were, which was true, but also because of the contemporary importance of Greece to the Western world, you know, the free world as it used to be called. And then, of course, once the Cold War finished, just as there was a great nosedive in the interest in this country in Russia, then there was also a nosedive in the interest in Greece. You know, what happened in Greece was no longer so important somehow. Just as what was happening in Russia, they thought at the time, was not very important. Of course, now it is important because of the international ramifications of what Russia's doing. So I think it's interesting. There are ideological reasons why, you know, modern Greek has been of greater interest to people in the 70s and 80s than it has been since then.
Can I ask if you actually reassess your research and your publications? Do you think that you had like a linear, let's say, process, or there have been changes or diversions or alterations, major turning points that you consider to be important?
Yeah. I mean, I should say that I've carried out very few major projects. I mean, the only major research project I carried out. Well, no, actually, I'm talking about funding now. The only major research grant I ever got was for this research into what I called Greek Macedonian cultural identity. That is the development of a Greek Macedonian identity since 1912. And for that I applied to the Leverhulme Foundation and got a grant to employ my colleague Eleni Yannikaki as my research assistant, and
You
we
did the
produced a
book.
book
You did the
based
book.
on a conference, and some articles on that. But apart from that, my research has been, I don't know, fairly random, if you like. I mean, I think I felt myself to be a completely free spirit, and I've just suddenly, you know, one day become interested in something, and I think, oh, I might write an article about that, or, you know, sometime later something else. That's why I keep going from language to literature to history. You know, I move around, and it's probably a good idea, because I think the language and the literature and the history all interlink. They all, you know, my expertise in all these three, although history is the least expertise, but anyway, all these things somehow influence each other in my mind and in my work. As for whether the progression was linear, certainly the stage I've been going through in the last 10 years, which is the years of my happy retirement, has been actually quite different from before. Not mainly because I've got much more time for research. I mean, research is what I do most of the time, whereas before I was doing teaching and administration. I should say, by the way, that when I was at Oxford, there were some terms when I was, or years when I was teaching 18 hours a week, you know, which is quite a lot.
That's a lot.
For a university teacher.
That's a lot.
So I've been much freer to research, but I've been much freer to think as well, you know, to think kind of laterally. And I think, looking back, at the beginning, I was very, perhaps I was, what can I say? Well, I was young and I was naive, nothing wrong with that. But I think I was actually quite a lot influenced subconsciously by the Greek nationalist ideology. And I think I used to be criticised by some colleagues elsewhere whom I won't name for having sort of bought into the Greek nationalist ideology. I don't think I ever really bought into it, but I think I was influenced by it. It was a sort of perhaps an uncritical view, you know, of everything Greek being wonderful and beautiful and positive, etc. I've now become, you know, more sceptical, but then it's also to do with getting older. You know, you do get sceptical when you get older, and it's not necessarily a very happy thing to be terribly sceptical. But I think certainly in the last 10 years, I've actually extricated myself more or less entirely from sort of the vestiges of nationalist, Greek nationalist influence, I think. To the extent that, you know, I feel in my work on the language question, what have you, I'm kind of trying to expose the nationalist ideological assumptions behind the support of Catharovisa, for instance, the language purism in Greece. I suppose that's really what I would say, but not. There certainly hasn't been. What there has not been in my career has been a kind of planned progression. I've never sat down at some point and said, right, for the next 5 years I'm going to work on so-and-so, then the next 5 years I'm going to devote myself to so-and-so, and then the next 5 years... It's never been like that at all. I've just been attracted... I've been very lucky, I suppose, that in my research I've just been allowed to do anything I think is interesting to me, and I hope that what's interesting to me might be interesting to other people as well. When you asked me before the interview, you know, what are the most, sort of most positive things that you've taken away from your interest in Greece, you know, I would say without any hesitation that the great joy for me and the great privilege that I've had in my life has been working on Greece, has been working in Greece, has been working with Greek colleagues, has been making friends with Greeks, and, you know, my life obviously has been completely different from what it would have been if I'd continued to study law at Oxford, got a degree in law and become a solicitor or something, you know, working on divorces and what. So, you know, it transformed my life, totally, absolutely transformed my life, and it transformed it absolutely for the better. I have absolutely no regrets at all. I mean, one of the best things I ever did in my life was to change from law to non-Greek, you know, because it really made me a very happy man. So, you know, I've been absolutely thrilled to be working on Greece all these years, you know, a lot of my best friends, most of my best friends are Greeks, I would say. And other people living in Greece too, because I've still got a lot of friends who I met in the 60s who are living in Greece who are expatriates, who have been expatriates all that time. And I still go and see them. And you know, this has been a great joy for me. So Greece has been for me a sort of, it's certainly become Δεύτερη Πατρίδα. It became that very early on. But it's become a country that I've been very emotionally involved in, which is why, you know, for the last few years I've been very distressed by the crisis in Greece, and you know, wish I could do more to help and or whatever. Of course, you know, my view of Greece is definitely not, you know, the 100% all happy country that I thought it was at one point. It's not only my own age, but it's also what's happening in Greece itself. But Greece is a unique country. There it is in Southeast Europe. It's a Mediterranean country and it's a Balkan country at the same time. That gives it some absolutely special flavour, and the fact that it has the longest coastline of any European country, that's another one that gives it a special flavour. It is a unique country geographically, and from the point of view of its position sort of in the cultural world. The fact that it has got the antiquity, of course I was criticising the excessive, sometimes excessive, what can I say, obsession with antiquity among some Greeks. The fact that it does have antiquity, and the fact that it does have Byzantium, I haven't mentioned Byzantium at all in this interview, does make it, of course, much more exciting than it would otherwise be. You know, if one was working on Serbia, for instance, would that be so exciting? You know, Serbia doesn't have Serbian antiquity that one knows of. Of course, it does have a wonderful Byzantine past. Serbia, I don't think, has any islands. You know, there are all sorts of things where Greece wins out vis-à-vis Serbia. So, I mean, Greece, I'm saying this really, of course, partly jokingly, but I mean, Greece is in a very privileged position from a geographical point of view. It is in a very exciting area, you know, from the point of view of international history and international politics, isn't it, ever since ancient times and still today. And it's in a very attractive area too, aesthetically attractive for visitors, and I hope that tourism will continue to be successful in Greece, but I hope it will also be within limits, so that the tourism doesn't, you know, destroy the land that the tourists actually go to see in the first place.
Thank you.